Welcome all, and want to welcome Alexei Gloukhov here. He's visiting from Russia, where he is associate professor of philosophy at the Moscow National Research University for the Higher School of Economics. He's currently a Fulbright professor, a Fulbright scholar at Princeton in the Center for Human Values, not so far away. So we actually almost had him come here as a Fulbright scholar. I think there was a chance of that. We were talking about it, but he went to Princeton instead, so we wish him well there. But we're thrilled that he was able to visit us and come up and give this talk. The talk is called Arendt and the Question of Positive Freedom. It relates to two of her main essays on freedom, on revolution, and her essay, What is Freedom? Something many of us have been spending a lot of time talking about recently in the Arendt seminar. So we welcome you here. You'll talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation.
Thank you, Roger, for introducing me, for inviting me here. It's a privilege for me to be here in the Arendt Center in Bard College, and I'd like to thank Tina also for making it happen. And the subject of today's talk is Arendt and the question of positive freedom, and I want to share my thoughts about why Arendt's legacy is very distinct in the theory of freedom, and what can we make out of it today in contemporary, very complex world that has changed to some extent since her time. First, a general remark. It may be very easy to explain why Arendt's position on freedom is so exceptional. There is so to say standard account of what is going on in the theory of freedom. There are two concepts of freedom, so-called negative concept of liberty and the positive concept of liberty. This distinction is based mostly on the seminal essay of Isaiah Berlin, Two Concepts of Liberty. And Berlin was a supporter of negative liberty, of negative concept, and he defined it as non-interference. This non explains why this is the negative concept. Moreover, Berlin actually demanded from a political theory, a liberal political theory in his case, to refrain from the positive concept. One can say that he didn't succeed in convincing everybody, especially here in English-speaking hemisphere. Almost every political theorist uses the negative concept of liberty. And it came to the point where some scholars even doubted that the very existence and meaning of the positive concept of freedom, and it was, of course, contrary to to Berlin's intention, because for him, positive freedom was not only real; it was a danger for the humanity, because he believed that some positive concept of freedom, of liberty, underlies totalitarian ideology. And for him, the positive concept of liberty is in the end responsible for the most evil crimes in the history. Another recent trend worth mentioning is the rise of so-called neo-Roman or Republican theory of freedom. It's also negative. It was developed by Quentin Skinner and Philip Petty, mostly, and they define freedom as also negatively as non-domination. Petty's position is in particular interesting because, as he puts it somewhere, the Republican theory is the genuine opposition to positive freedom. So it's a complete reversal from positive concept. And also he argued that his understanding of negative freedom as non-domination should supersede the liberal understanding of negative concept as a non-interference. So, against this backdrop, it's obviously it's clear why Arendt's position is exceptional, because she embraced positiveness of freedom. But this picture might be oversimplified, because, and here I would like to introduce the notion of school of thought. It's a very general term, but I think it's a very important one. And I might need to say a couple words about new kind of dogmatism. And Arendt actually loved to love those imaginary conversations between a dogmatic, a skeptic, and a critic, and she always sided with the critic. And her favorite philosopher was Kant, who introduced the word critics into philosophy. But it's important to recognize that allegiance to critical stance, to critical school of thought, may in turn give rise to some sort of dogmatism, of very new kind of very new breed. And it's important to realize how much Arendt's thought is dependent on her school of thought. This is the only way, it is for me, to appreciate her real originality. As I said before, in the English-speaking political theory, almost everybody supports the negative concept of liberty. But if we turn to the old world, to Europe, to the continental tradition, the picture changes dramatically. And it's sufficient to drop several names like Martin Heidegger or Gilles Deleuze or Alain Badiou. These German and French philosophers might have very different theories, but they all, and Arendt also, belong to the same school of thought. And against this backdrop, some of her, one can even say most interesting, most striking metaphors for freedom don't show anymore much of originality. For example, her view of freedom as a miracle, as an exceptional, very short-living event in history. Ideas like that doesn't come as a surprise for somebody who is versatile in Heidegger or Alain Badiou. It's very close to what they said. And once we recognize a certain level of dependency in Arendt's thought, we can explain, for example, how can it be that on the basis of the same historical material, the legacy of ancient Rome, two completely different political theories emerge. That of Hannah Arendt and that of Philippe Petit, for example. And the explanation is very simple, because the same historical material was subjected to two different methods of interpretation, which come out from two different schools of thought. And for me, it's a very important marker, because wherever Petit and Arendt happen to say completely opposite things about freedom, it seems to me that this is the case of certain dependency on their schools of thought, rather original political observations. Now I'm one step closer to explaining why Arendt's position on freedom is really exceptional. The key word here is realism. Unlike other representatives of the same school of thought, Arendt was a political realist. What does it mean? She might have used certain partners of thinking, the same as Heidegger or Deleuze. However, she always was keen to focus on the real political problems. And if it was necessary, she would rather try to use alien patterns of thinking than to lose the focus on the problem. And under this view, Arendt's position on freedom is not only an exception in comparison to the analytic tradition, but also in comparison to the continental school of thought. And maybe it's one way of interpreting the famous opening of her book, Between Past and Future. Our inheritance wasn't left to us by no testament. So we do have our dependencies, but we are not committed to them if we want to pursue real political issues. So basically we can distinguish two strategies of hers. In some cases, she surprises with her paradoxical way of thinking about freedom. Freedom is danger, but we should not step back from it, because where danger is, there also is the salvation. She might strike us with metaphors like miracle or infinite improbability. However, something like that we can also find in Heidegger or somebody else. The conclusions of those trains of thought are sometimes almost disappointing. If we consider freedom to be a miracle, it may backfire and lead to indifference to freedom, since in this case freedom as miracle has almost no chance in the real world to happen. And this metaphor may even eclipse the most crucial part of the conversation about freedom, that is the problem that freedom is. And indeed, what is the problem with freedom as miracle? Prima facie, it's the risk that we wouldn't be lucky enough to experience something like that in our lifetime. But this is hardly what Arendt had in mind when she approached the problem of freedom. Her other strategy seems to me much more promising. Although the difficulty is to recognize that it is a strategy, because it might rather look like a hesitation on her part. For example, she begins with the strong word, virtue, in her essay on freedom. Then this word has very dubious background, because it's the key notion in Machiavelli's Il Principe. And then, without much explaining, she easily shifts from virtue to virtuosity, presenting this word as a better metaphor for positive freedom. One can wonder, why didn't she begin with virtuosity in the first place, instead of compromising her concept with dubious connotations? However, after we learn that she translates virtue as excellence, and then in the final chapter of her book on revolution she comes out with another dubious but inevitable for her notion, elite, we realize that she might intentionally keep returning to the point where her concept of freedom becomes problematic. Because this is what freedom is. It's a problem. Arendt offers two solutions to freedom problem. In one case, she is very close to the liberal thinkers. She used to criticize for the lack of understanding of political freedom. She poses the problem in the manner that suggested rather a negative definition of liberty. She asks, for example, how freedom can be given to people under the condition of non-sovereignty. And her solution appeals to the concept of spatial distribution, which is totally alien to her scope of thought. Nothing like that can be found either in Heidegger or in Deleuze. She describes the elements of freedom as islands or oases in political reality. One can find it very similar to what Berlin described as areas of individual liberty. And one can call it compromise or lack of philosophical radicalism on her part. However, this is exactly what makes her position so unique in the 20th century. She was a political realist, and she wasn't ready to ignore the real political problem for the sake of a beautiful theory. And there is another solution she indicated in her book on revolution. Instead of distribution of space, this solution uses the distribution or separation of powers. Whereas the laws that have conceptual affinity with just spatial distribution can only limit the power and lead to depolitization of political reality, the separation of powers results in their mutual competition, and therefore they can even increase their strength. A solution of this kind was implemented in the American Constitution that deserves the name Constitutio Libertatis. Now I move to the final part of my paper. How can we do and think something like that in the contemporary world? And here I try to build upon Arendt's theory. I single out the key notion she appealed to when she was trying to stick with the problem. For example, the notion of excellence, her translation for virtue, virtù, Italian word, and the notion of elite, which was inevitable for her in the end of book on revolution. The ancients identified virtue and the good, excellence and the good. So the freedom problem acquires a paradoxical twist. The formulation like, how can the good be no evil? The answer seems rather obvious. How can good be evil in the first place? If you are really good, it can't bring any evil, it can't harm anybody. And this consideration returns us back on the track with the logic of freedom, with her school of thought, rather than with the logic of justice and spatial distribution, which is typical for liberal and neo-Roman approach. This leads us back to the thinkers like Heidegger or Deleuze. Does it mean that Arendt was wrong when she parted her way with her school of thought? Absolutely not. In order to solve the problem, you have first to see the problem. You can't have a solution to the problem that doesn't exist for you, as it didn't exist for Heidegger or Deleuze. They didn't understand freedom as problem. So what is the benevolent excellence? The excellence that makes good and doesn't destroy political realm. Why do we need to talk and care about something like that? I think a great number of political problems in contemporary world converge to this particular issue. For example, the American exceptionalism. You had a great conference here back in October on this topic. The fate of liberal tradition and of Western philosophy in the complex postmodern world. The role of public intellectual or an artist in the society. Whenever we try to make a difference, there is a case for benevolent excellence. And if we think about, as we always should, how our excellence can be no harm for others, the simple answer is be good as only you can at what you do. Be the best. This is the only salvation. So, thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So great, thank you very much, Alexei, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion. There's a lot of questions that I think are raised. There's a lot of there's some assumptions you make that we could spend time on that I don't know if I want to. Whether Arendt comes out of a school of thought, I don't think so. Not in the way you imagine it. Simply just to think about who the influences on her for freedom are, you'd have to include Jefferson, René Char, John Adams, Hegel. You never mention Hegel in the paper, but the idea of Eigentum and the relationship between property and freedom is absolutely essential in her thought. Heidegger, but for Heidegger, freedom has nothing to do with politics. It's about standing in the Ereignis, Inständigkeit, which is a event, and they're somewhat miraculous, but very in a different world. Montesquieu, Machiavelli, just so many different people. It's hard to call her, to say that she comes out of one school of thought around anything, let alone her idea of freedom. The more interesting part, from my point of view, is talking about her idea of freedom, and you identify two parts of it. One separation of powers, and the other is the idea of the islands of freedom, which aren't individuals, but are always spaces where people can act together. She is clearly worried that these spaces are becoming ever smaller and less. The other part that sort of surprisingly isn't in your paper is the section on why freedom has become a problem today, which is the rise of necessity, the rise of science, the rise of the social question. And so much of what she's talking about is that freedom always had spaces in the world that were places where people could act together. In the modern world, there are fewer and fewer of such spaces, and we limit them with a government designed to provide answers to the social question, and in doing so, limit and regulate what people can do, so that politics becomes administration as opposed to action. And so her worry is where these spaces of freedom will continue to exist. Can they continue to exist? And the one place that she sort of holds out at the end of the book is the Supreme Court, right? I mean, as an island of freedom, as an oasis of freedom, and it's worth thinking about that. The idea is that the Supreme Court could have been, she says, and was for a certain extent of time, such a freedom, because it was a bunch where 9 people came together and reenacted the freedom of the founding over again, and the experience of freedom. So there's two parts of freedom for her, both foundation and also the experience of acting together. And I guess I'm wondering if you're trying to argue that you're trying to call for or argue for certain of these spaces of freedom in the modern world. Where would one find? I mean, is that the premise of the end of the book? or the end of the paper? What are the spaces of freedom that you see alive today, or is that the question that you're trying to ask? Does that make? I mean, I guess part of it is I'm not sure entirely. You want this to be relevant politically, as far as I understand it at the end, and yet, what are the spaces of freedom that you're suggesting may or may not exist in the modern world?
Thank you, Roger, for your comment. Yes, I understand that talking about dogmatism in relation to Arendt, and this is may take as a surprise, of course, but this is why I actually prefer to use the term school of thought. And I don't want to go into the history of philosophy into those details. The problem with freedom, as Arendt posed it in the end of the book on revolution, with introduction of this the surprise introduction of the notion elite.
Well, you said it wasn't a surprise. I happen to agree with it. It's not. She talks about the elite in every book she writes.
Yes, that might be so, but she went into a lengthy justification of this step.
Because it's mostly misunderstood.
Yes,
and it's not the elite. It's not the elite of an economic elite or intellectual elite or an inherited elite, right? It's an elite. Well, you want to. It's an elite that proves itself
political
in action.
avant-garde, something like that.
I don't like the word avant-garde. I don't know why
yes,
you want to use it. It's not. She doesn't think of it as an avant-garde. They're not an intellectual. They're not leading the masses. They're a group of people. I mean, and this is something she says in every one of her books. The truth is, most people in the world don't want to spend their time thinking, which is why thinking is not one of the vita activa that she puts into the human condition. And she says the same thing in this book. The truth is, whether we like it or not, that most people in history, in any society, would rather spend their time raising their kids and working and making a living and fulfilling their lives than they would involved in politics. Most people don't actually want to be involved in politics, even though she thinks that to be free means to be involved in politics. Right? So that most people don't want to be free. So what that means is that the elite are those people who get together and start doing things for other people and acting in politics. And other people say, you know what? Go, I like what you're doing. You can represent me. You can have some power and in a sense, you can govern until I say no, right? And then that elite governs, and then there's some of them want to spend a couple hours a day on it, but not every day on it, and then they go up and up and up, and you get this pyramid of elites that she talks about. She says the problem with politics today is that we choose our politicians because they're people who want to make a living. They're professional politicians. They're not actually people who've proven themselves as representatives of the people in any meaningful sense. So, I mean, so that's not an avant-garde as I understand it, right? Is it?
Okay,
I think that's an elite that's chosen step by step by step from the bottom.
Group of people.
Yeah.
Yes, maybe.
And then leaders emerge contra to Occupy Wall Street.
Avant-garde was always wrong, but it's active people.
Yeah.
Who, unlike others, the normal, ordinary, average people. And actually, this is for me is in obvious relation with what Heidegger says in many works.
Okay, I mean, it's not obvious to me. I mean, Heidegger doesn't have a politics in this sense. He has the idea of individual Einständigkeit in the.
I wouldn't agree with the thesis that Heidegger doesn't have politics, but it will
but I mean,
lead us astray from the main course of our conversation. So, for me, the main point of her introducing the word elite in this case was that the problem of freedom has two sides, not only one. Not only the political space of freedom is in danger.
Mm-hmm.
This is one problem, but there is another one. People, the ordinary people, are also in danger from the expressions of freedom, from politics. And this was the point of her notes, remarks about the elite in the end of book on revolution. And these...
I'm sorry, I don't know. You mean that the elite will provide the lawyers?
No. I mean, like, okay, I'm from Russia. I will speak about Russian Revolution. So, there was a political active group, Bolsheviks,
Yeah.
and they came to power, and they
But that's not what
changed.
Arendt means by the elite. Not at all. She means by the elite, the people who rise up through the Soviets.
Okay,
Who
and
the Bolsheviks
what then became out of Soviets?
They were crushed by the Bolsheviks, by the professional politicians and revolutionaries.
But I think that she wanted to keep the story inseparable at this point, because she explicitly mentioned that it's very important for her that the defense will work both sides, not only for the space of political liberty, but also in order to defend ordinary people from politics. As I understand those pages in the final chapter.
To defend ordinary people from
Yes.
politics?
Yes.
Where in those pages do you see that?
Oh.
I mean, I mean, the premise of the elite, as I understand it, is simply that people engaged in politics will not engage all the time in politics, and that some will emerge who want to engage more in it than others, who enjoy it more, who love it, and are willing to spend their time on it, and they will be chosen as the leaders. And
Do they become the elite?
they become
that you
the
speak
elite
of?
of the politics yes, which are opposed to the Bolsheviks or professional politicians. They're supposed, but even though they become an elite, their power always comes from the fact that they represent the people below them.
And such elites and such groups of people require spaces, as I understand it. Is that what you're suggesting? Could you give me another example of, besides the Supreme Court, which I'm very distant from, so...
Yeah, town hall meetings.
Spaces, town hall meetings, that's what you were
Town hall
referring to,
meetings, or
spaces.
what she calls the ward system, building upon Thomas Jefferson's idea for a ward system.
Those are the
or the
spaces.
Soviets in the Soviet Revolution in 1917. These are local institutions, right, that emerge. People come together and begin to engage politically, and not just have conversations like in Occupy Wall Street, but actually try and govern. And then what they realize is that to govern, they're going to have to elect leaders, and they elect the people who most succeed. They don't.
Is it your point, Roger, that these spaces are diminishing in the society in which we live?
Well, it's certainly her point, and I would agree with her. Yes, I mean, I think that first of all, most people today don't want to spend the time engaged in politics.
In a town hall meeting.
In a town hall meeting, it's seen to be a joke, and it's seen to be a waste of time. And not only that, it requires us to actually make hard decisions and spend our money. So we push the decisions up to higher levels, made by bureaucrats and technocrats, and we increasingly don't. And this is what Alexei is talking about. We lose this idea of acting freely, which is what he's calling positive freedom. Arendt uses that word once or twice, but really we call it political freedom. I mean,
Yes.
I find it also. I mean, I didn't want to mention. I find it interesting and somewhat problematic to sort of try and pull her into this world of positive freedom, which is really, at least as it's usually understood by someone like Kant, and in Berlin's essay, is an attempt to articulate what freedom is. Whereas for Arendt, freedom is simply to act. I mean, she has two parts to it, and I think they're both important. One is to found, act of foundation, and the other is the experience of creation and thus destruction. And she thinks you need both the experience of destruction and creation and the experience of foundation. So I guess I do have I wonder why to call it positive freedom, but that's I don't want to get too caught up on words. I mean, I'd rather us talk about the phenomena.
Actually, I mentioned this issue in my paper where I said that we might be wrongly attributing Arendt this concept, because this concept comes out from analytical tradition. Because it's not her own concept.
Yeah.
But anyway, still, my point is that the freedom problem has two sides, and this is why she asked, for example, how freedom can be given to people under the condition of non-sovereignty. Because freedom, expressions of freedom can become dangerous in case they are not under this condition of non-sovereignty. So freedom can be dangerous, and political freedom can be dangerous, and it can endanger the lives of ordinary people. And this is what I call hesitation on her part. But for me, it's genuine political realism, because she clearly sees the problem. That the problem is both sides.
Can you say more about what? I mean, there's a lot of dangers that we can think of as freedom. I'm just trying to understand what you mean, what the danger you have in mind.
Okay, as I came from a different hemisphere, it's probably much more clear for me than to you what I mean. Because, for example, if we look at her book Origins of Totalitarianism, what she actually did there, she showed the dangers of positive freedom, which is not under condition of non-sovereignty. So the dangers, the perils of totalitarianism, this is the danger the freedom can do to ordinary people if it is not under the condition of non-sovereignty.
Okay, I mean, she showed the danger of joining a movement and being part of a fantastical belief system in which you think there's only one way to understand the world. She's an opponent of sovereignty. You're right, but from her point of view, there is no freedom in totalitarianism. So. And that's because freedom for her always means to act together with others, and thus a plurality. So totalitarianism is the erasure of freedom. I mean, with obviously leftovers that don't get erased, that become points of resistance.
Yes, you are absolutely right. She never applied the term freedom to totalitarian systems, but I think, and the notion of school of thought helps in this case. She clearly understood that the way Heidegger thought about the world, about politics, because he did have political thoughts, in my understanding at least, and it had similarities to her own patterns of thought. And she was trying to break with this dangerous legacy. She was trying to save what is to save, the good, the best part of our understanding of freedom. And this is what she defined as freedom, as non-sovereignty. But it's only a definition. It doesn't solve any problems, because the real problem is that people like Heidegger, they thought almost like her. It's in some points, in some patterns of thought. And to what did it lead in the history? It was a disaster. And for her, this was the problem of freedom. She never defined, she never connected explicitly her definition of freedom with totalitarianism, but it was behind this problem.
Jeff.
So I'm not. I can't say at the outset that I should say at the outset that I'm not as versed in Arendt's thought as other people around the table here. My own reading of that concluding chapter of On Revolution is that Arendt saw like freedom as this kind of, and spaces of freedom or islands of freedom as fragile, and in revolutionary moments, like there was a kind of a danger, but it was the danger for freedom and for spaces of freedom began well before the specter of totalitarianism arose. It was just, okay, we've revolted, we've overthrown an order, but now we got to administer, and we actually have to. It was the problem was not totalitarianism; it was the problem of institutionalizing that moment of foundation. And so I'm wondering, does that sort of the specter or the problem of institutionalization, how does that figure into your own account of what Arendt is saying about freedom?
Actually, I don't find much originality in this train of thought, because something like that you might find in Heidegger. In every anti-Platonist in 20th century, including Derrida, including Deleuze, and so on, they are all against administration. They all are against distribution, and against a Platonist logic like that. And it's she absolutely she was right on several points here, but it was not her original contribution to the political problem.
Okay, well, It's interesting. I mean, just because you thinking about your comments about her as a political realist. I mean, I think that, like, if I'm thinking about the Arab Spring most recently, or like in Egypt, where there were revolutionary assemblies that were sort of working very actively to not just counter Mubarak's regime, but then, like, once he was gone, to actually sort of act in a, to enact freedom. And what I think for Arendt it's actually quite, in a sense, it's almost tragic, because revolutionary moments occur in polities where some kind of administration is actually necessary. Like, I don't see her as actually being anti-administration. Like, I mean, that's one of the, administration is actually, if the polity is going to continue to exist, there has to be some kind of administration happening, but the tragic element enters when revolutionary assemblies actually realize that, and they actually are very ill-equipped. What's made them great as revolutionaries actually makes them terrible administrators. That's my sort of take on Arendt there. And so there's this kind of pivotal moment, this moment of transition that's actually very, very difficult to turn. And I actually appreciate Arendt for sort of even whether it's original or not, I appreciate her discernment in the kind of challenge that sort of immediate post-revolutionary moment poses.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you're absolutely right, and we can find these thesis in Arendt. It's no doubt about that. But my point is different. The story you present pictures freedom is something that is in danger, is a miracle, ever vanishing. But this is not the whole story. This is only one part of the story. Maybe not the most original contribution of Arendt into the political problem. I agree, she had a lot to say about this political problem, but this is only one part of it. Another part, and she saw it as clear as nobody else, probably, because she had this experience of her life in Germany and what happened to her friends, to her teacher, and how freedom and the way we think about freedom may endanger lives of ordinary people. And this is the other side of the problem. And this is where she has to change her sides, move to other school of thought, and introduce solutions that are very similar to liberal thinkers. This special distribution where we should separate area of individual liberty from public influence, from political influence. It's what Berlin says. It's almost the same. But philosophically speaking, theoretically speaking, the idea of special distribution is totally alien to her school of thought, meaning to Heidegger or Deleuze. Nothing like that we can find there. It was her intentional break with her legacy, because she saw the problem, and she tried to solve the problem, notwithstanding the legacy that preceded her thought. So this is my point. I don't contest that there is the problem you pictured. Absolutely, I agree. But as I understand it, her problem of freedom has two sides. Freedom is not only in danger, it may be dangerous.
It's oftentimes dangerous. that's a given.
Maybe one has to wait a long time to have the administration added on to what the revolutionaries eventually will need. Maybe it takes what, if your example is the Arab Spring, maybe we have to wait a generation or two before the Arab Spring shows any skill in this realm without moving into negative freedom.
But as for Arab Spring, it's the matter of future we can predict here. But we can take a similar example. For example, the Iranian Revolution back in the 70s.
Yeah.
It was understood by many political philosophers as something similar to European revolutions. For example, Michel Foucault was very excited about perspectives of Iranian revolution. He talked about something like political spirituality based on these events. But it turned out different. It turned out to be to be a fundamentalist regime. So, and we can say that in this case, freedom, the initial freedom, turned to be dangerous. So this is my point.
Roger, in a talk that you gave a couple of weeks ago, you pointed out that our first efforts as revolutionaries in our own society was unsuccessful, and it took several years for the development of the Constitution that we finally had. So what do you think about the notion of time going and a new set of people being involved?
Well, I mean, I think it's similar to what Jeff was saying earlier. This is a revolutionary question more than a freedom question, but it's a question about when a liberation, she makes a distinction between a liberation and a revolution is a foundation of freedom. It takes a while to found freedom. It's not something that just happens. Because freedom requires both two parts, right? And Alexei's been talking about something called the Constitution of Liberty, or Constitution of Freedom. There's two chapters that she writes on the Constitution of Freedom. One is on power, and one is on authority. And power, for her, is absolutely necessary for freedom, in the sense that you need to create multiple power centers that will limit each other, because laws, calling her a liberal or not, I don't understand. I mean, there are parts in which she is and parts in which she isn't. She doesn't believe that the rule of law will ever restrain power. And so she believes that there have to be, the only thing that can restrain power is power, which means you have to multiply power sources in a society in order to maintain and establish and found freedom. And the advantage, she says, that the United States had is that it had multiple power sources already in place at the time of its revolution. Whereas a country like Egypt did not have so many. It had the Muslim Brotherhood, really, which was the only one. And then it had new emerging ones in these councils and other things, which probably needed time. And the coup against the Muslim, well, first the Muslim Brotherhood's resistance against the liberals, and then secondly the coup against the Muslim Brotherhood has erased that opportunity. But the second thing that a revolution needs in order to found freedom is authority. And that's the real problem, she says, because authority in the modern world probably doesn't exist. And the main way that people have sought authority is through will, and the will of the nation, right? And if you seek authority through the will of the nation, you end up with sovereignty. You end up with a single national will, which is dangerous. And that's where the danger comes in modern revolutions of all kinds, monarchical, democratic, and others. The Americans, she said, had a solution to that, which was to create the juridical branch as a branch of powerless authority in the American governmental system that appealed back to the beginning, the principle of beginning, which all men have in them and thus they could recognize, and allowed the Supreme Court to act like a constitutional convention in eternal progress. It's a fascinating argument. She argues that it failed, right? It lasted for a certain amount of time, but it's failed. Because, and this I think Alexei says in his paper, because the principles of conservation, the need to make law certain, overwhelmed the desire to keep law free and fresh and being refounded at all times. And thus the authority that was so essential to creating the American establishment of freedom has largely disappeared. And yet she says there are still spaces where it's possible for it to emerge, and we have to keep those spaces alive simply to keep the idea of freedom alive in the modern world, so that maybe in times of another revolution, they will reappear. But I don't know, Alexei, maybe you want to comment on any of that. I'm not sure if that makes sense within your reading of the book or not.
Yes, absolutely, it does. The question was where we can find those islands of freedom in contemporary world, and this is a tough question. And
It is a tough question.
but the part of the problem is that Arendt sometimes suggests that there must be something like a structure, public structure or governmental structure that allows to those places to be, and it makes them dependable on those structures. Another thought of hers seems to me more promising. It's the idea of separation of powers. And there, everything was in different way. There was no union, the structure before the separation of powers in American constitutional process.
There was no union?
No union, no
Unified.
Yeah, no unified country. No superstructure that would precede.
There was no monarchy, there was no kingdom, there was no...
No United States. And these structures were, they emerged at the moment of, with the separation of powers. So these new multiple powers created this structure. So it's the way around, not the structure that precedes the spaces of freedom, but multiple sources of freedom, of powers, they created the structure. And I think this is more, I would like to say, natural way to think about the spaces of freedom. So they should create themselves. We should not rely on public structure and hope that they would help us.
Well, first of all, they've disappeared, right? She thinks the separation of powers has disappeared.
Yes,
And
I
secondly,
agree.
the Soviets are examples of spaces of freedom, islands of freedom, emerging out of nowhere. I mean, and you, I'm going to use a technical term, poo-pooed miracles. But to her, miracles are not miraculous. Miracles are an everyday occurrence in politics. And I've written an essay I take the everyday appearance of miracles as an important part of her political system, and not as an utopian, and not as sort of a defeatist element of her political system, but the idea that we must and we should expect on a regular basis miracles to happen in
Do you
politics.
have an example?
Yeah, and we have tons of examples. I mean, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement was an unexpected, miraculous movement in American politics. Probably the last great one, but I mean, there have been plenty of them. The 1932, I mean, the FDR was a miraculous, unexpected development in American politics. Those are big ones. There are smaller ones too. I mean, you could say Barack Obama, for some people, 6 years ago, was a sort of unexpected phenomenon.
Right.
He didn't pan out the way they expected. But, you know, there are smaller and greater miracles on a regular basis in politics. They're unexpected, spontaneous happenings.
I just, it just seems to me that the conversation about areas of freedom and a lot of the discussion is just sort of what you would expect from the nature of freedom, is that these, because freedom is always to something, and it's always about something, and it's always for something, and so it would just seem natural that these would be popping up and sort of being extinguished all of the time, partially because of this danger, and that's the inherent danger in freedom, is that it's never entirely inclusive. I mean, I have what I would include, you will have what you will include, and it just would seem to me as though it's a function of what freedom essentially is, and so you'll have these areas, and here they are today, and then something happens, and then there's something else, and I think that's what I was trying to understand what you said before about the danger in freedom, and you're talking about the elite, and then the danger to the rest of the people. I think has to do with that, what's included and what isn't included.
I agree that, and actually I was careful to articulate that one can get an impression that freedom as miracle is something miraculous, and there is no place for a miracle in everyday life, but it's not what Arendt says. But still, even if we keep saying that for Arendt, freedom as miracle is something of everyday life. In case we need to cite some examples, as you just did, we have to refer to events that happened 50 years ago. And
Not
these,
necessarily.
But if we ask Roger,
Well, there's two problems. One is we're trying to refer to events all of us agree on, right? And all of us know, coming from Russia and America and wherever else, the Netherlands, you know, I mean, we got a wide range of people in this room, so we have to apply. You ask for
Yes,
examples.
fair point.
They have to be
Yes, I agree.
big
Yes.
examples, right?
yes.
But on a local politics level, we can find smaller examples of this on a regular basis. I would say less and less, fewer and fewer. I mean, to me, the danger to freedom for Arendt is not what I understand to be positive freedom. It's not one idea. It's not Nazism or Stalinism or Marxism or I don't know what, ISISism. The danger to freedom for Arendt is on the one hand science, technocratic government, and the idea that we give up rule to technocrats who will make these right decisions. And the other is what she calls bourgeoisism, which is the desire to not live politically and let other people make decisions for us. Those are the real dangers to freedom for Arendt, right? Or not? I mean,
As I said, I agree that
Okay.
this is part of the problem, for sure. And as I said already, I see that in this point, she's not alone. She is in the company of many others philosophers, in particular in the company with her teacher Heidegger, who also didn't like science at all, and so on.
both of them like science in many ways. They think science is politically dangerous. I mean, she sees Heidegger as dangerous politically because Heidegger's response to the withdrawal, Heidegger's response is a kind of individual thinking that sees thinking as something between an individual and their and being, right? And she says Heidegger, because of that, abandons the political realm. Now, you know, you can that's her critique of Heidegger. She sees Heidegger's danger is that he abandons it, not that he creates a dangerous politics. She doesn't see him as a Nazi in that way. She sees him as a danger of withdrawal. But yes, I mean, Weber and many other people saw the dangers in scientific politics, not just Arendt and Heidegger and others. There's many of them. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been listening to an audiobook, The History of Science, and I'm right at the part where the church was so upset about science, and they took poor Galileo as an old man and put him under arrest. So,
Right.
Yeah.
I guess any group that sees science as a threat will.
Let me say, they see science as a threat, as they see it as a taking away decisions from people, right? They see it as a way of coming up with one answer that can, and if you have one answer, then you are justified in basically enforcing that answer on all people. That's the threat that she sees in Marxism and in all other scientific approaches to politics, including technocracy.
The threat of authority. Is that?
It's not well. It's
Is that
the it's
different?
it's the
Authority, yeah.
in a sense it's the threat of authority. It's the threat of, and this is where Heidegger fits into that. It's the threat of the philosopher who, because they're afraid of the plurality and fecundity of politics, seeks to subordinate politics to reason. And so she would actually put Plato and the scientists in the same camp, as I think Alexei said. But Heidegger, to the extent he's a philosopher, also, in a sense, falls into that camp for her in an important way.
And you talked about miracles, so something like Occupy Wall Street, even though it made a big splash, it didn't accomplish anything.
Yeah, it's a big debatable question, but I don't know. Do you have an opinion on Occupy Wall Street, Alex? Everyone here knows my opinion on it.
I would rather
No.
to know
Another question.
because I didn't share this experience. I
Right.
was here.
Was there any aspect of it? I mean, you've had protests in Russia
Yes.
recently.
Yes,
Has there been any Occupy Wall Street part of that or not?
We had something like that, and it was huge, but it's sort of,
Evaporates.
Evaporated, right.
Roger, do you have any small miracles at your disposal?
Just come talk to me after class. No, I mean,
Do we stand in line? Do we each get one?
I think
The day is a miracle.
I think this is the
No,
question today is
The
how
moment is a miracle.
There are
Our
lots
society
of-
cannot wait for another Roosevelt to come along. There must be some miracles that are occurring as we speak that enable us to continue to have a semblance of freedom.
The fact that we have a space like this is
Yes, but this is
Space
so
flight.
this is the interesting question. There are two parts to freedom, right? We said this. There's the experience of destroying and in a sense acting, and there's the experience of foundation. And the aesthetic element of Arendt's thinking, which I think Alexei is also interested in, is that to a certain extent, for the reason Martin Luther King succeeded, and we all know who he is because his action led people to
take action.
see it and talk about it and then react and act more, and it changed the way everybody acts and thinks, right? Lots of people can act. There are lots of tiny little actions all over the world. The problem is to act in a way that other people are inspired by it and such that they change their stories that they tell and their way of seeing the world. And part of the analysis Arendt has, and Alexei is right that she's part of a school in this, but I actually think she extends the school on this part of it, is to argue that in a statistically oriented society, all action becomes statistically explainable. And to the extent we start thinking of people as simply acting as liberals or conservatives or part of this school or part of that school, right? And this is my resistance to schools. We see them not as people who can surprise us. We don't see them as people who, in their action, can make us stop and say, holy cow, I gotta think about Hannah Arendt, and I think it's always a danger to take someone like Hannah Arendt and try and reduce her to or put her in a school. Precisely because she rejected being a school, because she wanted to be, and I think she was, original. Now, that's a big claim, and we can have arguments about it, but the reason the Hannah Arendt Center is here, and the reason the Hannah Arendt Center has thousands of followers and works in some way, is because enough people find in what she did something truly different and surprising, something that isn't what Heidegger did, isn't what Weber did, isn't what Hegel did. And as a result, she speaks to people who aren't just philosophers or academics, but she speaks to lots of people all over the world. And I think it's a real, and while you want to have the context and know the history, and trust me, I mean, I'm a Heideggerian, I read Heidegger, and I think Arendt is deeply influenced by Heidegger. So I'm not opposed to your reading her as influenced by Heidegger, but I don't think she is, in the end, anything like part of Heidegger's school, whatever that is.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Yeah.
On schools of thought also. I wanted to ask you about Arendt in Russia, but you can say something about that. You begin the paper with Isaiah Berlin, who is also
Yes.
Russian, born Russian, right?
Born in Riga, it's Latvia.
So you get a history of people moving from Europe,
actually,
Russia, Germany to the US.
I read, do you know Russian poet Joseph Brodsky, Nobel laureate? And I read his account of meeting Isaiah Berlin in London, and as he recollects, Isaiah Berlin spoke very fluently Russian, so he was, and actually he made a distinct impact on the underground currents of dissident culture in Soviet Union, because actually he achieved it by almost a single meeting with another great Russian poet, Anna Akhmatova, and this meeting had deep influence on her, and Brodsky was from her circle,
I mean, both Arendt and Berlin became major Cold War ideologists.
And they hated each other.
In addition to, so just talking about reception history a little bit, and about how these discourses migrate and how they might migrate back to Russia at this point in time.
As for Arendt, Arendt studies experience like Renaissance right now in Russia, notwithstanding the political situation. It's completely isolated from the current Russian politics that has nothing to do with this theory of freedom, I think. For example, this year two independent translations of her essay of freedom came out of print.
Came out in print.
Yes, it came out in print.
And you think that's totally irrelevant to the political situation that's going on in Russia?
Yes, it is, because what interests only a small group, almost a small fraction of population. Unfortunately, it's so it's a simple fact. But still, as to the history of Russian reception of Arendt's legacy, another curious coincidence. I happen to be a translator of her lectures on Kant's political philosophy into Russian, and it happens the same thing. Simultaneously with my translation, another translation of this work was published in Russian. So, and by now, almost all her major publications are translated into Russian. And the last thing I learned was a couple of days ago. I saw it on Facebook that a translation of her correspondence with Heidegger came in print. And I know there are a lot of people who are very interested in
So,
scientific
a very
legacy.
crude guess about why Arendt might be very popular in Russia right now could be precisely because of those protests against Putin government, given the absence of or the resistance to going back to a leftist revolutionary
yes,
tradition.
absolutely. And all of what you said here about vanishing spaces for freedom is absolutely applicable to Russian situation. And this is why I can only share your point. I don't against what you were saying about it. But so it's different matter. So that makes Arendt relevant.
But people don't want to go to Baju, they don't want to go to Deleuze.
They do. They do.
They do?
Yes. Actually, I would say people are desperate because they don't know what to do with this current situation because nothing seems to work. Nothing can help to change the political situation for better. It only gets worse every day. And the things you could never imagine yesterday happens today, and gets only worse every day. And by now I cannot make any predictions. In part, people are desperate and they try everything.
Including Alexei Berlin.
Not so much. And this, I would say, this is tragedy not only for Russia. I would say this is actually global tragedy that there is no competitive liberal theory today, because the last great political liberal thinker was John Rawls, and after that we saw the rise of this so-called Republican or communitarian political theory, especially here in the United States. And so the simple fact is there is no competitive liberal theory today, and it's almost tragedy because any Republican theory, any communitarian theory, inevitably focuses on the community. It doesn't promote universal values, and for that we might need some new version of a liberal theory. I understand that
Arendt be a liberal in your she certainly doesn't focus on the community.
Yes,
she focuses on multiple plural communities.
This was what I was going to say.
Okay, good. So I'm sorry.
She was against universal values.
Yeah.
Yes, I understand that completely. But
But so would Badiou, right? Or not?
But I would say we still might need universal values in this world.
She was for freedom as a universal value, right? She was for privacy. I mean, universal. I don't know what you mean by universal, but
something that is applicable to human in general.
she certainly thinks freedom is applicable to humans.
Not liberal freedom, not freedom as universal rights, for example, as I understand her position.
Well, the privacy she thinks
She
is
was,
something that
as far as I
every
say,
human
she
should
was
have.
more in Republican tradition.
Well, she thinks that a realm of private, the realm of the dark, right, the realm that you can't enter into, is an absolute requirement to be human. She thinks we're losing it, right? But she would certainly be someone, in fact our conference next year is going to be on privacy, who would be an advocate for the right to be unique and different and live your own life in private. She is an advocate for that.
Anyway, as I said, she partly appeals to some points some liberal solutions for the problem of freedom. In particular, her demand for separation between public space and private space. It looks completely like what Berlin might say on this point. This is what I wanted to say about the fate of liberal theory in Russia and globally.
Either of you have anything you want to add? No? Charles? Angela? No?
And my field is the visual arts, aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
In aesthetics, you have a structure. So,
Yep.
you know, all artists tend to be both unique individuals expressing something, but they want to express to multiple people.
Yeah.
So you have to have an aesthetic structure. And I think this is what happens in many groups. You want the individual, but it has to be freedom. And the concept that's generally used is freedom with restraint.
Yeah.
The restraint is the aesthetic structure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's another way of saying it, is what I'm,
Yes, and
proposing.
I think Art was absolutely right to introduce this connection between freedom and performing arts. That was her huge contribution and art history and overall. And but this also shows that as an aesthetic solution that may work, because if you speak about a flute player, as she did, in this case there's no danger. The virtuosity of the flute player can do to the audience, and this is the safe case for freedom. And it's a good example, and it was a huge success, I think, of her to introduce this point. But still, it's not strictly political understanding of freedom; it's rather aesthetical.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Just a different view.
Mm-hmm.
So, please let me join me in thanking Alexei Gloukhov. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. I start reading Arendt back in 90s, and my initial interest was connected with her account of totalitarianism, and I think her work on totalitarianism is still underestimated. This is very original work, and Arendt she succeeded in articulate several points about what happened in Germany and in the Soviet Union, which are absolutely worth noticing and are still not receive enough attention. My favorites in her works are obviously her essay on freedom and her book on revolution, because this is what I'm dealing with right now. I'm working on the theory of freedom, on the problem of freedom, and I think that she presented a very interesting concept. But her achievement was not only theoretical. Her main achievement, and this is why she is highly relevant now, is that she is a realist. And there are so few realists in the world. There are so few people who can think independently of what I call their school of thought. And Arendt could think realistically. She focused on problems, and she was every time ready to step over to another tradition of thinking or to another pattern of thinking in order to solve the problem she clearly saw. And I think it's her the real genuine part of her legacy we have to pay attention to